Hi there, I'm Jane Gingrich from Kamloops, British Columbia in Canada.
I'm John Boyd from Kamloops, British Columbia in Canada.
And as we are in the midst of a global pandemic with the novel virus COVID-19, as people of faith, we are here talking about Christian practice of Holy Communion, namely that in the Protestant tradition, and looking to have a discussion about what is the Eucharist, why is it important, why is it necessary, and then what does that mean during a pandemic. And so as we're thinking about these things and wondering what it means to gather as people of faith, where should we start?
I think we start with the Lord's Supper and what this has meant in the life of the church. And I think that we know it's a meal. Lots of us have grown up sharing meals around the family dinner table, so there's some basic things about what we know supper is and what it means. And we find all of those, I think, in the Eucharist as well. But then the church makes some claims that are more than just a meal about the Lord's Supper as well. And I think that seems to be what a lot of people are discussing right now as they miss celebrating the Eucharist.
It's true. As we're not able to gather right now, there are all kinds of conversations about what it means to be people who are celebrating faith while at the same time separate. And so while we are offering virtual opportunities to gather, pre-recorded services, live streamed services, videos where people can join in online, it's a complex, I guess I would say, topic to be addressing. And so part of what we were discussing is how do we understand theologically what is happening in that meal. And from the Lutheran tradition and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, we have an understanding of real presence. Just as you would serve a feast or have a meal like Thanksgiving or at Christmas where there's tinfoil covering various dishes that are brought to the table, so too when the elements are presented on the altar at the table, they are also often covered. And then after they are blessed, the meal is served and those are removed. And so for Lutheran tradition, thinking about real presence, that sense of Christ being in, with, and under the bread, the body, and the wine or grape juice host the blood, then we do have a sense of mystery about what communion is all about. And this meal, while set apart, is also intended to be nourishment that goes with us when we go out. A place where we connect with God and recognize the forgiveness that we receive from God as well. So this is a very important meal for us as Christians. How do we continue to figure out how to gather while we are not able to be together physically, while we are practicing this distancing, what I like to call physical distancing, while maintaining social connectedness?
Yeah, well, I think you've said it very well, as this meal that we share together in the belief in the real presence of Christ given for us in that shared meal. And that brings up the question of what it means to say that the meal is a communion. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be an area of conversation right now, is how is communion possible if we're not physically gathered together the way that we normally are in congregational setting when we're all together in the same physical space. And that gets to be hard in terms of how to have the conversation, because I think we then tend to focus on either the physical or the spiritual. But there is in Anglican tradition already a dialogue between a way of seeing the Eucharist kind of in a heavily spiritual way, affected by the Holy Spirit. And there's another side of the conversation with its own tradition in the corporeal or bodily presence of Christ in the Eucharist as well. And
you mean that in terms of the assembly present?
Yeah, I mean that in terms of the assembly present, and I also mean that Christ, as far as this tradition understands what's being received, is that it's not just the spiritual, but it is really the bodily presence of Christ that we're receiving as well. And I think the tension, there's got to be a tension between the two somewhere, rather than emphasizing spiritual over corporeal. And I think sometimes that can become the stumbling block for our conversations and how to understand and how to nourish our people in faith, how to nourish each other's understanding of what the Eucharist is maybe the danger is in preferring one over the other. And that's especially when we're all connecting online and we're connecting virtually, that gets to be a real argument.
And so you're talking about the contrast of the idea of spiritual presence, thus it wouldn't matter if we were in the same room, versus the bodily presence of the assembly, meaning those who are gathered for worship. And then saying that really when we're talking about what it means to be in Holy Communion together, you can't separate those and lop one off from the other.
Yeah, I'm listening.
Thinking about it that way.
I'm thinking about it that way, and I'm really hearing those voices that are saying the two are mutually dependent on each other, and we have to be careful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thinking about how Lutherans understand sacraments, having Holy Baptism, Word in the water, Holy Communion, Word and body and blood, bread and wine, gluten-free wafers and grape juice. You can do all that at home. Not having practiced this conversation in advance, throwing something out there, I remember as a child watching a film about a family that it was kind of like a historical drama of a film. And there was a family that was, I believe, headed to a concentration camp. And somehow they knew that they were going to be separated from each other and might never see each other again. And there was a moment where the father in the family had this little piece, I think it was toffee, in his pocket. And he took it out, he had a little knife, and he cut it into enough pieces for each member of the family to share and receive one of those. And they all paused for a moment. Nothing was spoken, but they all paused, having that little piece of toffee. And there was a holy moment there, and they had that piece of toffee. Of course, this is a film. But thinking of how we have precedents and recognize emergency baptisms,
Right.
that film depicted an urgent, even emergency situation in that they were facing their deaths and recognized that. At what point do we say, well, this is an emergency, or this situation calls for people to gather in different ways, perhaps as a family or a household, and have communion on their own beyond the community of the assembled body of Christ in a worship setting like a church or neighborhood or whatever it might be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. From the Lutheran perspective, that is a really important part of the conversation, is needing to assess what exactly constitutes an emergency. And I think that's where it gets a little fuzzy, because certainly from our perspective, this is an emergency. I think the question becomes, is it a sacramental emergency, or is it simply, not to be gross about it simply, right, but is it just a public health crisis which I think is a very important distinction that, to the best of my limited knowledge and reading that I do kind of on the side, emergency was defined in our Lutheran understanding as the gospel itself is in danger of never being preached and heard again unless
Right.
something's done.
Just like a situation with an emergency baptism where the person
Exactly.
might be facing their own death.
Yeah.
Similarly, as depicted in the historical drama, people facing their own deaths. So a mortal emergency, not a crisis, being the separation.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is what's wonderful about the conversation and what's wonderful about the way in which people want to talk about this and feel the need to figure something out, is it shows how far we've come by faith, that more and more the Eucharist is desired by people on a regular basis. People see that as being an incredibly important part of being church, and that's wonderful. I think we do have to pause and ask ourselves, is there an end to this?
Exactly.
Is the world with COVID-19 in it now an actual crisis because it's going to go on forever and we're in danger of
You
never
mean
celebrating?
emergency. It is a crisis, but you mean
Yeah.
emergency.
Yeah, well, thank you. I should be more careful of the language that I use around this too. Yes, is it an emergency that has no end, and therefore because we don't see an end to it and we don't see a time where we're ever going to gather again, we have to find a new way of communing? Or is it that it's going to be a long time for us, like a couple of months, but there will be an end to that and we will come together again? I think that's where we have to be very careful in these conversations.
Well, and the beauty, I dare say, of this happening in the season of Lent for us as Christians is that we are in this season of, in some ways, being entombed. And certainly in a season where we're recognizing fasting and encouraging greater opportunities for prayer, reflection, and in that self-reflection looking at opportunities for reconciliation with ourselves, with our neighbors, with creation. And so as we are fasting, it becomes a time of fasting even then from Holy Communion. And what's difficult is we have a date coming up for Easter.
Yeah.
And so recognizing that that is such a wonderful feast in our tradition, it would be amazing for us to be able to know that we would be safe to be in close enough proximity to have worship and to commune together on that day. And yet at the same time, when we think about this as a crisis that will have an end at some time, which we still hope that it will, and that will hopefully be within a number of months as opposed to much longer than that. And so fasting for that length of time until we are able to be together and then celebrating communion will be a grand sense of celebration, feasting, and resurrection and new life in coming together again. And so I guess right now one of the struggles I have is trying to plan for how do we celebrate something that already has a date that's only a few weeks from now, when in truth we might not be celebrating our context as much because we could still be right in the midst of this crisis and struggling to find ways of being in close proximity to each other and maintaining safe distancing so that we're not getting each other sicker or sick. It is an ongoing conundrum. As we continue to reflect on this, what's always important to be recognizing is how in every context that we find ourselves, be it here in Kamloops or any other city around the country and around the world, each and every pastor who is serving a congregation and every other rostered leader, deacon, or minister is doing their best to serve that community in the best way that they know how. And so we need to keep these conversations open.
Yeah, exactly. that it is a conversation, which means that there's room for conversation, addition, input, and also a lot of listening, and assuming that everyone is approaching the pandemic from a position of trying to care for people, which gets really hard because we do love the Eucharist as much as we do, and so people get very impassioned talking about it, and I respect that. And I think also at its root, the Eucharist unifies, it upbuilds, it gives life, and I would hope that the conversation would mirror the nature of the Eucharist itself.
So being here in Kamloops, serving a Lutheran church, Hills of Peace Lutheran Church in Kamloops, BC, we are in kind of a unique position as a faith tradition in this country.
I serve St. George's Anglican Parish in the Territory of the People Anglican Church here in Kamloops.
And so, recognizing those two denominations, there is a special connection between the two, having a full communion agreement that we do, because unique in the Council of Canadian Churches, these two denominations work together and actually recognize each other's practices well enough that we can have Holy Communion together. There is very little other precedence for that, even in other countries around the world. However, in Canada we are unique, and so I think it's really a gift that both the Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada are able to engage in conversation about what it means to be in communion with each other, but also what it means to share that gift in every context across the country. And so I'm glad for this conversation, and I hope that the discussion stays open and continues on among our colleagues and friends across the country as we navigate and discern how best to serve God's people in the world. Well, now we put the questions back to you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening.